Welcome back to Revenue Unplugged. A quick one before we start. If you're getting value from Revenue Unplugged, please hit subscribe, give us a like, and leave a review. It genuinely helps us reach more sales leaders, and I really appreciate it. Right, here's something that'll change how you think about the revenue leader's role. It's not just about pipeline management anymore, or even deal progression, or just hitting numbers. You're now an orchestra conductor. Greg Leos is General Manager and Head of Payments at Weave, and he's got a view that'll challenge you. Most revenue problems aren't sales problems, they're orchestration problems. Finance and legal can't be advisories anymore. Engineering and product aren't just support functions. And if you don't own marketing as a CRO, you're not a Chief Revenue Officer, you're a Head of Sales. And that's fine, as long as we're clear-eyed about it. We're diving into the talent war, building cultures that actually multiply revenue, and why accountability has to start with you as a leader. As always, grab a brew, sit tight. Let's get into it. This is Revenue Unplugged with Greg.
Greg, welcome to Revenue Unplugged. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. You brought with you some really interesting topics that we're going to be discussing. The evolution of the revenue leader and in the talent war. And I'm really excited to talking about the right culture is a revenue multiplier. And I've got lots of great questions for you particularly around that topic. But before we get going, as always, Greg, it'd be great if you just give our audience an idea of who you are and what you're up to.
Yeah, for sure. So I am the general manager and head of payments for a company named Weave, which is a publicly traded software as a service company based in the States in Lehigh, Utah. What we do is we provide an all-in-one communications and patient engagement platform that powers SMBs, small businesses, and all the way up to mid-market. And they're business healthcare practitioners like dentists and ophthalmologists and veterinarians. And what we do is we just power that first patient engagement all the way through to the final payment. And what I do specifically for them is I'm the executive over their payments division. And I have a wonderful, high-performing team that focuses on payments acceptance for our healthcare practitioners, revenue collections, and we provide things like traditional card acceptance in the doctor's office, text to pay, post-visit, buy now, pay later, all the traditional payment methods, as well as also patient financing. So, our North Star is we want to help our customers get paid more consistently, more frequently, so they have viable businesses, and ultimately so that they can take care of patients and provide great healthcare.
So let's dive into this because you are a very credible sales leader with lots of knowledge and lots of experience. So you've chosen 3 topics that have not been discussed on the podcast so far. The evolution of the revenue leadership. Why is that important to you right now? And why should we be discussing that as a topic in 2026?
Yeah, well, what I often hear from fellow revenue leaders and revenue executives is friction in terms of how the revenue leadership role has changed. If you go back even just 10 years ago, it very much was about pipeline management, deal flow progression, and hiring and retaining high-performing salespeople. If you are even a middle manager in a revenue leadership function, that job has fundamentally changed. And in my opinion, you are now an orchestra conductor. You are now not just singularly focused on sales, or even if you're a CRO on revenue, you are focused on the entire ecosystem. I believe pretty strongly most revenue problems are not sales problems. They are orchestration problems. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is we as sales leaders and revenue leaders now need to fundamentally understand the roles that marketing, customer service, engineering, product play in terms of a revenue outcome, right? Marketing owns demand gen, demand quality. Engineering can own velocity. Product can own value realization. And if we're not engaging them the right way and bringing them in terms of what we're trying to accomplish, we will ultimately fail.
If we look right at the top and if we go at CRO level, breaking this down, should the CRO be responsible for marketing?
Yeah. So I have a wonderful friend, Warren Zena at the CRO Collective, who talks about this passionately. If you are a CRO and you do not own marketing, and when I say own, have responsibility for, most certainly if you don't have responsibility over customer success, you are not a chief revenue officer. You are a head of sales. And that is okay. There's nothing wrong with being a head of sales. I've been one a number of times. But let's be clear-eyed in terms of what the remit is. But I'll take it a step further. I will say whether you're a head of sales or a CRO is largely irrelevant. You still need influence and impact. If you are not bringing in marketing, even if they don't directly report to you, if you're not bringing them in to your weekly, monthly, quarterly calls, if finance and legal, here's a wild one. If finance and legal that are often looked upon by my peers as adversaries, if they're not brought in and bought into what you're trying to accomplish, you are not an orchestra conductor. Unfortunately, you will instead be running uphill.
I really understand the marketing side and why it's important to have those guys in. The buyer's journey is critically important. Why finance? Why legal? Why are we talking about these guys in 2026 as being involved in the go-to-market plan?
Yeah. Well, I'll answer your question with a question. Can you be successful in 2026 as a revenue leader without finance, legal, engineering as your allies? You can't. You fundamentally can't. They have to be bought into what you're selling, and they have to be a part of your team, whether that's a direct line or a dotted line.
Is that new though? Have they always needed to be part of it? So what's changed now to make you say, right, you fundamentally have to have these guys involved? Because I know from the conversations that I've had is that particularly when they look at a CFO, they're either a deal maker or a deal blocker. As a salesperson, right? That's what a salesperson say. They've either got a CFO that helps deals to happen, or they've got a CFO that blocks them. When you look at legal, they're like, either there's a legal team that really helps to get contracts done, or they're a massive hold up in trying to get contracts done. So they've always played a part. You've never been able to do deals without finance. You've never been able to do deals without legal. But why, when we're talking about the evolution, why are we bringing that to the forefront and saying they need to be in the room with us?
You bet. It's always been there under the umbrella of collaboration. We always want to collaborate across functions. We always have, right? The reason that it now has an outsized influence on the outcomes is because of velocity, because of complexity. And you need more people in the room to get, particularly if they're enterprise deals, to get those deals across the finish line. There's so much nuance when it comes to negotiating a contract with a customer, for example, particularly when it comes to price concessions and discounting, particularly when it comes to the terms and conditions of an agreement, what you're going to give up, what you're going to get. It is so important that a revenue leader, a CRO, the CRO's best sale is not external, it's internal. And we used to think as CROs, as revenue leaders, we needed to bring our team along, but the team has to be more than just your sales team. It also has to be the functional leaders that are going to help you succeed. And it's important that you sit side by side with that CFO so that they understand, number one, what you're trying to accomplish and why it's important. They may know conceptually the board needs us to hit a number, but you need to help them and guide them to understand the process to get there. Other thing is they need to trust you. CFOs and legal folks have too often run into revenue leaders that are willing to cut corners. Let's be honest. So we have a bit of a reputation to overcome. I have found personally in my experience, the moment that trust is created, they become true allies in the revenue process.
Do you think as the role as the CRO changes and develops, we look at it now is that the CRO has to cover a number of different teams. They are looking at data from everywhere. They're looking at messaging. Do you think that it always needs to be a head of sales or a VP of sales that takes on the CRO role, where it seems to be moving arguably away from selling?
Yeah, there is an increasing penchant to get a RevOps person to be your CRO leader, right? I'm passionately opposed to that. Nothing wrong against RevOps folks. By the way, I think they're essential. And being able to measure metrics, have clarity around metrics, and understand at each step of the way understand what your take rate is, understand, I can go on and on. If you don't know your numbers as a CRO, you are not running a business. But you need folks that are going to have, one, sales acumen, who have carried a bag before. That sort of experience bodes well for your ability to lead a team of sellers, number one. Number two, you need a modern leader that can speak across functions. Somebody who is as adept speaking to a finance person as they are an enterprise seller, as they are an engineering lead. And that takes somebody who is experienced and skilled beyond just revenue operations and metrics measurement.
I totally agree. I think that there's still a critical part of being a CRO is being able to understand what is a white lie coming from the sales business about where it is and what it's doing. And I think that comes from experience and knowing where something is, and also being able to truly read and understand what the data is saying. Because I always say, people tell me, I can give you data and it tells everything okay. I can also look at it and tell you why there's a problem, right? It depends who's telling the story and which angle they're looking at it, which is why I think the CRO still needs to come from that valuable background of building sales up.
Couldn't agree with you more. I think the root cause of why we're seeing more of that is private equity. Private equity, and by the way, I've worked for a number of private equity companies. This is not meant to criticize. I have had some wildly successful outcomes with private equity. God bless them. I think it's great. But often they haven't operated inside of a business and they view sales as a math formula. And there's some truth to that, by the way. We have evolved this role to be much more process oriented and much more numbers specific. That is great. But if all we're doing is thinking it's a math formula and you input some data points and you have an outcome, we're losing sight of what you've already described, which is the nuance and the sophistication of running a true sales engine.
Before we move on to the next topic, what advice would you give to aspiring CROs, or maybe CROs that are new in the seat at the moment, about how they handle the environment that they're in and work through to really involve the finance and the legal team? Because I guess that's probably a hard bit, because then they might not be I don't know, so I'm not speaking from a voice of knowledge, but I can't help to think that legal and finance might not want to be involved in sales talk. Or am I wrong?
You're not wrong. There's a natural resistance. If you're a CFO, you signed up to be a finance person, not a salesperson. If you're a legal person, you may not even, frankly, enjoy being around salespeople. And some of that does come, as I mentioned earlier, some of the reputation issues that I think maybe we suffer from with some of these functions. I would answer it sort of this way. Two things. Number one, I've referenced earlier, if you are a CRO and you do not have direct impact and a reporting structure that allows you to impact marketing flow, MQLs, that sort of thing, then you're ahead of sales, right? If you don't have CS and you're given a revenue number and you really have no true control over how to retain the revenue that you've sold, then you're ahead of sales. There's nothing wrong with being ahead of sales, but there needs to be clarity around what the role is. And I think sometimes there's confusion. I see a lot of CROs that are leading up a team of 5 to 10 sellers. You're not a CRO, right? And what's important, and the reason that's important, is not just from getting the title correct, but it's alignment with the CRO, with the CEO, alignment with the board in terms of what you're capable to deliver. So that's number one. Number two, I would say for CROs, you don't necessarily need more control beyond what I've described, but you need more influence. You need to think about how to influence all pieces of your organization. You are an orchestra conductor, and you may not want to play the flute ever. I don't want to be a finance person. I'm good with numbers, actually, but I have no desire to be a CFO. So any CFO that's listening, that possibly would be listening, I don't want your job. I respect the job that you do, but it's not for me. But we have to be able to understand the needs that a CFO, a CTO, a head of legal have. What's important to them? What's important to a head of legal? It's reduce risk. I don't want to get sued. Right? If it's a CFO, I want to maintain profitability, right? I appreciate you want to scale, but let's scale in a way that actually is healthy for this business from a financial standpoint. Understanding where they're coming from, meeting some of their needs, but also helping to guide them to understand why it's so vitally important that sales succeeds so that we have a viable company is incredibly important. And as I referenced earlier, the whole key to the kingdom on this is about trust. If you show up as a professional, if you listen to them, if you're interested in the job that they do, I'm fascinated by legal contracts and legal constructs. I don't profess to be a lawyer, but I'm actually intrigued and I listen to what's told to me by the legal part of my company, and I'm fascinated by it. If you can show up that way, you will engender trust and they will be more personally invested in your success and your team's success.
I think what you mentioned there is absolutely critical. You have to show a genuine interest in all the areas. And it comes back to that added old saying about salespeople, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. And it's spent a lot of time listening, understanding, and asking great questions in those environments so they don't feel like they're being spoken to and they're actually proving a real valuable part. I think that's a critical part of a leader, is bringing everyone together and making them all feel like they add the same and equal amount of value as everyone else. So really appreciate you bringing that topic to the front and center, and good to discuss it. We're going to move on to winning the talent war. Now, I think this is really interesting because I think 2020 is going to see some hiring taking place, but it's not going to be on the same scale. We're on a road to recovery for sure, but we're never going to see the same hiring back of like 22, 23, where sales leaders were hiring huge teams and had almost bottomless pits of cash to hire. And there was a talent war then. Now you've got less headcount, you've got to fill it with the best people. It becomes even more important that you win the talent war. So firstly, you've put it up there. So you obviously think the way salespeople are recruited is broken. So what's your thinking around the problem at the moment? And then we can discuss how we solve it.
Yeah. This is a great topic that I feel like we could spend 3 podcasts on. We talked about being an orchestra conductor a moment ago. We talked about legal, we talked about finance, engineering, product. We didn't talk about recruiting, and that is also essential. If you are a sales leader, a revenue leader, and you don't have alignment from your recruiting function, you will not be able to attract top talent. But here's something I'd like to take it even a step further. And I'll start with this. We talk a lot as leaders, regardless of function, about employee engagement and culture. And we'll get to that in a moment. I think culture is a very hijacked term. Employee engagement starts with interview number 1. Hard stop. We seem to think employee engagement starts when they onboard or when they're given the offer letter. It's well past that at that point. Their experience during the interview process. If it's an elongated interview process, you're going to have an employee, if you ultimately hire them, show up in a less than engaged fashion. If you don't show up on time to interviews, if you have folks that are not very good at doing interviews, if you are unclear what the job is or what the metrics are or what success looks like, you will have, if you hire them, an employee that shows up confused and unfocused on day 1. And that stalls revenue.
Particularly in today's world where social media plays such a big part in everything, the candidates that make it through, but also the candidates that don't make it through, all need to be advocates of the business, because they may not be right now, but they might be right for later. One of the things that I find super interesting, if we go to the interview process, the amount of times the hiring manager doesn't do the first stage interview. Where's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Passionate about the fact that is a big mistake. When we say number 1, though, let's be clear. Clearly, there is a place for recruiting, a part for them to play, right? They screen candidates. I mean, I just posted a role and we received close to 150 applicants, many of which weren't qualified, unfortunately. And I'm so grateful for our recruiting function that is able to clean a lot of that up, do some of the preliminary interviews, and really screen for me viable candidates. But ultimately, it starts with me. I am the hiring manager and I'm extraordinarily busy. But if this role is going to report to me and I am the hiring manager, I'm the person that will hire this role, it has to start with me and I have to make time for it because I'm setting the table and setting the tone. And I can't offshoot that to someone else further in the interview process to tell me whether they're a good fit or not. I can't wait to the end to be able to do that. I have to show up early in the process.
From a candidate side, it's so important because a lot of these candidates will class as a passive candidate. And they are showing up to that first stage interview with curiosity, not necessarily interest, but curiosity. And I'm constantly saying to the sales leaders, the founders, that it's your job in that first interview to turn curiosity into genuine interest. And that has to come from the top. What would you say that you've gained by doing the first stage interview that perhaps if it's a HR person, so removing the recruitment function out of it, who've spoken and qualified, said, you know what, this person's got the necessary skill set. What advantages would you say you've seen by you taking on that first call rather than somebody in your team or even HR who do play a critical role in the hiring process, but I don't necessarily think it should be the first stage interview? What advantage have you seen by carrying out that first stage interview?
Yeah, I think it is essential. One of the components that is essential in a good recruitment process is clarity around what success looks like, what the job is, and ensuring that the candidates have a clear understanding of the range of compensation that will be offered. It's also essential that communication be done right at the outset around what the culture on the team is, what we stand for, and an understanding of what the candidate can do, not only to create outcomes, but also to contribute to the continued strengthening of that culture. That is so critical in terms of my success as an individual and my success as a team. I cannot hand that off to anyone else because what might be clear for me may not be clear for someone else. So I need to set the tone right from the outset. And if I see obvious red flags, if I see somebody who perhaps comes from a competitor or is extraordinarily talented, but by the same token is going to blow up my culture and ultimately drag down the performance of the overall team and ultimately create a net negative experience for everyone, they're gone. That because I have my finger on the pulse of the culture, the outcomes, the team, our performance dynamic, I have my finger on the pulse. Others may not. And it's important that I do that. It is not easy. You have to find the time. Practical suggestions is I often interview outside of normal business hours. I have to. I'm too busy otherwise. Good candidates that are truly interested in, they will be willing to take a call at 6 p.m. Quite frankly, top producers prefer that because they have deals to do. So, and if you position it the right way, I think most of your best performers, your best candidates would be willing to do that. So you can make time for it, for sure.
I always say if something matters enough, you can fit it in and do it. You mentioned elongated interview processes. I think one of the I think there's two reasons why, or probably three reasons why hiring doesn't go according to plan. One, we won't touch on too much today, but I think sometimes we get hiring right more often than we think, but we get onboarding wrong, and that's where we lose people. Long interview processes are definitely why we lose people. And you're right. If and this isn't the same for everybody. How are you putting together your interview process, and who's involved, and how long should it be?
Yeah. Well, I always suggest, and I try to live by this, run hiring like it's a revenue process, right? Clear stages, fast feedback loops, have clear and defined decision owners, timely follow-ups, right? If you're running a pipeline and you have a prospect, you're not going to take 2 weeks to get back to them if they have a question. You're not ghosting a prospect, but we ghost candidates. Radical transparency. The second that customer or a prospect in our pipeline, doesn't have transparency, they get skeptical and they're out. Same thing with, let's look at candidates the same exact way. And signal standards early. Show up on time to your interviews. I know this is basic stuff, but You'd be surprised how often I hear this happens. If you're not showing up on time to an interview, you cannot expect a candidate to be on point if they're hired, because you're telling them it's acceptable to not show up on time, to not show up the right way. So be honest about expectations, pacing. To your question about how many interviews, I think that was part of your question as well, right? It varies, right? It varies. It varies on the type of role that you're hiring for. If you're a CRO or if you're a CEO and you're hiring for a CRO, there's going to be a lot of interviews. I mean, that is a pretty high impact role, and it's going to have board level interviews, no question. If you are a head of sales or a CRO or any sort of sales leader and you're hiring for a sales rep position, you do not, that sales rep candidate does not need to interview with 15 people in your organization. It just does not. So in my mind, it really is dependent on the role. I think clearly you need to have recruiting and HR. They have that early stage function. They need to make sure that generally speaking, the candidates fit a certain profile. The hiring manager needs to interview twice, one virtually, and then a longer, deeper dive at the end when a decision is being made. And then in between, you can have, a number of different interviews, but not 10. And some of those interviews should be peer level. I'm a big believer that if you have a producer, a seller on your team that is looking for career growth, maybe they're looking to be in a leadership position at some point, or quite frankly, are just interested in doing this sort of thing, designate them to a degree. You don't want it to be a distraction from their selling process and their outcomes. Have them do peer level interviews and encourage them to be radically transparent. Tell them, I am not going to check on what you shared or what you said. I want you to share the good, the bad, and the ugly about working here with this candidate so that they come in with eyes wide open. If you can get that piece successful, good candidates will really love that, because most good top performer candidates understand they're not looking for perfection in a company. They're looking to understand what the challenges are and can they deal with and overcome those challenges. And once they get those challenges in a transparent way shared with them, that I think actually elevates their interest in a company and in a role.
I can second that, and I can tell you that all top performers not only want to speak to a peer, they will actively ask, because one of the biggest motivators behind them, they'll be like, who was the biggest earner, how did they do it, and they will want to have a conversation with that, because that's what they're ultimately looking for. Can they do what that person did? And also checking, is what you're saying the truth, right? One things that salespeople are always said to do is ask the question, check and verify. So I think that's ultimately very important. How much training do you give to people that are involved in the interview process about what they are looking for? Because I have the other challenge is that you could even have 3 interviews and say, I've got a really slick interview process. It's just 3 of us, but the interviews are identical, just talking through the resume, who they are, what they're about. So do you invest much time into coaching development, saying, right, you're the second stage, this is your role, this is what you're looking for?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up. It is one of the biggest gaps that I see in business today. Hiring and retaining talent is crucial to have good revenue outcomes, right? There's no question. And what we underinvest, in fact, often we don't invest at all in upskilling hiring managers and folks that interview on how to interview. To your point, they show up, they read through the resume. Or worse, and I hear this from candidates all the time, and I've experienced it even myself. You show up to an interview, it's 30 minutes, 28 minutes is listening to the hiring manager drone on in an explanation about what the role is, and they don't ask anything, they don't listen, they don't probe, and it comes down to what they read and the impression they're left with in terms of whether you move to the next stage. To answer your question, talk about feedback loops. I give a lot of feedback to the folks on my team that interview. I did the interview. I heard this. How did this go? What are you focusing on? What sort of open-ended questions are you asking? Because look, number one thing I hire for is grit. It is not pedigree. It is not working for a competitor, what school you went to. All of those things are important, good predictors of success. But the biggest predictor of success, in my opinion, is, do you have the ability to take that passion and match it up with tenacity and resilience? Because challenges are going to come, particularly in the sales game. So I want folks that have grit, that can dust themselves off and come back stronger the next time. But here's the thing. If I ask a candidate, hey, candidate, do you have grit? Sure, I do. Do you overcome obstacles? Yes, I do. They're all going to say that, particularly in a sales function where their natural instinct is to sell you on themselves. So you have to ask open-ended questions. Give me an example of an instance where you failed miserably at something. What did you learn from it? How did you handle it? If they struggle to answer that question, that suggests a few things. One, they're not being forthcoming with you, or two, they haven't really thought through it. I want people who have thought through failure. The top producers have learned from their mistakes, and they are confident enough to describe them in detail because they know they will overcome them. And that would be an example, I think, of a good interview technique that I want to continue to instill in my team, and I try to coach up the folks on my team who interview candidates.
It's an ongoing conversation the whole time. You get a room full of not just sales leaders, but any leader, and they'll tell you that character is the main thing that they'll interview for there. So I'm not surprised there that you mentioned grit. Grit is something that in any organization as a salesperson, grit is the number one characteristics that will have part of success. So why do we spend so much time interviewing about skill?
Sales leaders and revenue leaders, and I can say this confidently because I'm one of them, are under more pressure today than they've ever been before. The speed that we work, the velocity of the expectations are intense. There is no question. You can be wildly successful one year, and that wild success becomes the baseline for the next year, right? And you need to grow off, doubling revenues, right? So I get it. To answer your question, it's because we're under duress, right? We've got to find somebody who can immediately come in and hit those sales numbers. I got to get that top performer from a competitor, and it's plug and play. I don't have to hear this all the time from my fellow leaders. Greg, this sounds good. I want to upskill my interview technique. I don't have time. I appreciate what you're saying, that I need to be relatively first in line with interviewing. Greg, I don't have time. I have a number to hit. I'm empathetic to that through that pressure as well. But here's my answer. You don't have time not to do this. You have to. And again, maybe it's interviewing off cycle or in a non-traditional hour and trying to find candidates who are willing to do that. But you have to do that because I understand the short-term need, but you're not going to be able to hit your number if you don't have a quality team. Look, I'm very confident in my skills. I think I'm a very good leader, and I think that's proven through my successes. But let me be very clear on something. The success, and we've been wildly successful at Weave in payments over the last 2 years, that success is not due to me. It is because of the team that I've assembled, and an incredibly high-performing team. And it's because I have focused on hiring and also retaining and cultivating this tremendous team. We are successful because of them. Again, I am an orchestra conductor.
How regularly should a sales leader be interviewing? If you truly want to win the war on talent, are you interviewing when you've got sign off for a role, or are you interviewing every week?
Yeah, great question. And I want to respond, though, to something you just said, because I think you made such an outstanding point. Behaving poorly during the interview process, it is this negative loop that will just drain you and take you to negative outcomes and ultimately force you to find another job. Okay. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you perform or behave badly during the interview process, you will ultimately hire people who have a bad taste in their mouth, which ultimately means they are less likely to stay on your team, which means you're right back to feeling the pressure of having to fill that role that was left open mid-year. And you're right back to it again, right? So stop the madness, interview the right way, bite the bullet, take the time, do it correctly, and then hopefully have to interview less frequently because your good employee retention goes up and your good employee churn goes down. To answer your question, though, we as sales leaders always have to be hiring. We always have to be networking. I invest in my network consistently. I post frequently on LinkedIn, one, because I want to give back I've been very lucky in my career, and I want to spread a little bit of that luck around and inspire fellow leaders, but also it's because I want to draw in people into my network that potentially can work for me and be on my team. And I am consistently having discussions with top performers where I say, look, I don't have a place on my team now, but I'm super impressed with what you've accomplished. If there's anything I could do to help you in your career, let me know. I want to be of value. But number two, I want to keep this dialogue going, because if I have an opening, I'm going to be calling you. And that has worked incredibly well for me and has shortened the time cycles sometimes for the types of roles that I hire.
Absolutely. And also helps you get those great people through the door. So I think it is really important. And it's something that I talk about, is that, sales leaders, you are hugely busy people, but you need to have in your week a time where you're spending valuable time networking, having conversations with the people that could potentially come into your team. We could talk about this all day. I want to leave it with one last thing before we move on to the right culture. That first interview with the sales leader, I think there's two things that sales leaders need to make sure that they're walking away from that interview is, one, that they've sold the business and the opportunity in a right way. Because if you're trying to turn curiosity into interest, and the second bit that gets missed is that sales leaders need to come away knowing what motivates that individual. If you know what motivates that individual's going to go away having had a conversation where he feels the sales leader has a genuine interest in that person, because you could only get that by asking the right questions. Also, you know what to sell back to later on. You know what makes them tick. You know what they're looking for. So you can structure the story around what they're looking for to do, exactly the same as closing out a deal. I'm excited about this last topic, because you chose to say the right culture is a revenue multiplier.
Yeah.
You didn't choose to talk about a particular culture. I have been inundated over the years about culture, and I think sometimes it is just a load of words in sales kickoffs that go up on a screen. And then also slipping into culture is, I say it all the time, pizza Fridays and bean bags that you can sit on, and all sorts of stuff that your company gives you for free. You talk about the right culture, Bill. Why is the right culture a revenue multiplier? And then I'm going to ask you, how does a business work out what the right culture is for them?
Yeah. Well, the term culture has been hijacked, hasn't it? And I am passionate about culture, but often, I scoff and, oh, culture. Let me maybe start off with this. I believe to my core, and I've seen it proven out, that a team will never outperform its culture. I've never seen it. In well over 20 years in business, the success of a team is directly correlated to the strength of its culture. Now, let's be clear on what culture isn't. Let's maybe start there, right? And you touched on it a little bit, but culture isn't a slogan that goes on a poster on a wall. Culture isn't a slogan, to your point, at a sales kickoff, and a slogan that is not even abided by and lived by the very leaders who talk about it at kickoffs. That's not a culture. A culture is not foosball tables in the break room. It isn't catered lunches. It isn't snacks. Those are amenities. And they're wonderful. I mean, Weave offers a day off for all of their employees called a wellness day. That's wonderful. And that is an ingredient in our culture, but that is not our culture in and of itself. Culture has to be a set of standards and beliefs that are lived by the team. This is what we stand for. This is how we behave. This is what matters to us. An environment of accountability, an environment of transparency. When you say that you have a culture of people first, but then lay off employees on a whim to meet the next quarterly earnings estimate, you don't have a culture, you have a slogan. A culture has to be something that's lived, and it has to be invested in every single day. My team at Weave, we have a culture of performance and extreme accountability. We are very focused on outcomes, and everyone who joins our team knows that we work hard and we're super passionate and incredibly competitive. We want to win. But part of our culture is, alongside everything I just described, we're very collaborative and we take care of one another. we don't lose sight that we're human beings. And I hope that they would say, if they are on this podcast with me, that they have leadership that is personally invested in their success. No, we don't. We're not a family, because you don't fire. You don't fire your brothers or daughters when they don't perform. No, we don't treat each other like family, but we lift one another up. We respect one another. And one of the joys that I truly have is seeing them grow and progress and make more money and all of that. And I think all of that is sort of what we stand for and what our culture is.
The only way that you know that culture is truly happening is when actions take place, when a leader isn't anywhere near the environment. And I think in today's world, where the hybrid remote working is growing and growing and growing, I think it's becoming even harder to have the culture. I think even before that was a thing, I think culture and camaraderie was kind of mixed together, and it's like, we're a unit, we're together, we're one team. But that's not necessarily a cultural thing, or it could be, but it could be a bad culture side of it. One bit that I would like to touch on that you mentioned there is that within the culture that you have where you are, is that the team help each other out. And they don't leave anybody behind. Salespeople will often be told that they're lone wolves, they're out for themselves. So what does that look, to give other sales leaders an idea, what does that look like in your business when you're talking about them not leaving people behind and there for each other? What are you looking for these salespeople to do, and what behaviors are you seeing from them off the back of it?
A couple of different things. It's a wonderful question. I think number one, when you are leading a sales team and you're trying to build the right culture, is best that you can. And look, it's not always going to land well with every single salesperson, but you have to consider, again, this is being the leader and the orchestra conductor. You need to make sure that these salespeople understand that you are singularly focused on helping them to make more money, right? If they buy into that, then they'll begin to understand why that pipeline review is important, as much as they prefer to just go out and sell deals, right? If you help them to understand that if we focus on the customer, perhaps we focus on profitability in addition to growth, we will have a much more viable business, and it will afford them more opportunities. Potentially compensation plans will become more profitable and more lucrative if we are able to be a more successful company. To your point, it's tricky, particularly with salespeople, because they do tend to be very myopic, and they do tend to want to be lone wolves. That is part of the personality that goes into a salesperson. But as much as you as a leader can help them to understand the bigger picture perspective, and look, it comes back to what we talked about: hiring, retaining. What type of individual do you want on your team? If you're going to go and get the top producer at your competitor that you think is going to come in, plug and play, and do well, but only think of themselves and blow up everyone around them just so they can get a sale done, is that ultimately who you want on your team? So if you construct the team the right way, some of these things about appealing to their greater sensibilities and helping them to understand we have an overarching number to hit as a business will land better.
I always think if you've got the buy-in to the bigger picture, then you're on to a win. How important, and I touched on it on my final point on the last topic within the first interview, but how important is it as a sales leader to understand the why of their salespeople, to be able to create the culture that they're looking for? And the reason why I say that is because you don't, in my opinion, have to, it's not just about knowing the why, it's actively helping them to achieve their why, because it demonstrates that you're willing to go out your way and do something that isn't necessarily going to help you, but you're helping them help themselves. So can you truly have that culture that you're talking about if you don't know what their why is, and you are, in some instances, just giving more commission or motivating with a carrot?
It's a great question. And it all goes back to, we were talking previously during the interview about the interview process, isn't it? Right? Right from the very beginning, if you are not helping candidates to understand the why should they come to this company? What are we doing at this company that is special? If you don't know what the culture is on your team and you cannot articulate that during the interview, you're already in trouble. So be clear on what the set of standards and values and behaviors are on your team so that when you show up to an interview, you can actually explain that to a candidate so that they can be very clear-eyed that, for instance, when I'm hiring for a role, I make it very clear to candidates, we have an extremely elite level work ethic on my team. You're going to show up and just hope to get a paycheck and get through your day, you will be miserable, and you will. And there are jobs out there, I suppose, maybe fewer these days, but that are like that. That is not possible on my team. And I'm very clear about that. But here's what you get. You get career progression, you get investment, you get all of these different things that I explained to them. So it isn't just about us, it's also about them. The other piece is understanding, to your point, what is their why? I ask on interviews all the time, not only why are you looking, but give me an example of the ideal team and company for you to be a part of.
Yeah.
What are you hoping to achieve? Give me 1, 3, 5 years. What do you want to do? And sometimes candidates can't articulate that. And that suggests to me maybe they don't belong on my team. But I do want to hear that, because ultimately what we need to do down to an individual employee level, down to a rep level, is understand what their goals are and what their motivations are so that we can plug into that to elevate performance and create the outcomes that we need.
I think you touched on a really good point there. If you're talking to a salesperson that can't articulate their why, they're not going to be a top performer, because the motivation will fall away very, very quickly. And if there isn't a very clear why they're doing this in a business where you need grit and resilience, then you're not going to have a top performer. One of the other, so when we're talking about culture, accountability comes up regularly, and they say, right, I have got a culture of accountability. And they'll often talk, have you got accountability because everybody's bought into it? Or is there fear that if I don't do it, because you still got accountability, but one's toxic and one is right? Question, is accountability in a person a characteristic trait, or is it something that can be taught? Because I believe it's a characteristic trait. And so therefore, you can only have a true, in my opinion, and you may have a different opinion, you can only have a true culture of accountability if you've interviewed for accountability and you've hired someone that has that characteristic trait. Would you agree with that or disagree?
Yeah, I think alluding to going back to one of my answers previously, where I ask open-ended questions around, give me an example of a time that you failed and how you handled it. That's accountability. I hold myself accountable for the mistakes that I've made. I've learned from those mistakes and I'm doing something differently next time. So I'm not only interviewing for grit, I'm interviewing for accountability, right? But I'll take this answer a bit in a different way. If you as a leader want accountability on your team, it needs to start with you. You are the leader, obviously. Do you hold yourself accountable? Do you stand in front of your team and say, you know what? I kind of screwed that up. Here's what I'm going to do next time. Do you freely and openly admit in front of your team that you don't know everything? I'll give you a quick 30-second example. I went back and forth yesterday with my product leader, and she had a position on something related to a new release we're going to have, and I took a different position. I actually listened to her. I understood and was self-aware to know that I get very myopic on revenue, very myopic. So I need other folks who are going to have different voices in the room. And she shared with me with a position. I listened. I held myself accountable for my myopia. And I said to her, you know what? Let's roll with your point of view, because I think ultimately over the medium and long term, you're probably going to have the most successful outcome. We're going to have the most successful outcome. That demonstrates to her a level of accountability in myself. And then it rings true when I demand accountability from her and from the rest of the team.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And other little ways it can show is with sales leaders is when you book a meeting, don't move it last minute because something more important came along. If you say you're going to do something, do it. Don't get to it if it's on that list, because I think that's totally right. The sales leader sets the tone. And if the sales leader is on point, I think the rest of the business will follow suit. As soon as the sales leader's not on point, then the rest of the culture falls away.
I'll make one other comment, this return to office thing that I hear a lot about. And by the way, I think there's a lot of benefit about being in an office. I think 100% remote, all the data shows us there's some challenges with that at the employee level. But I frequently hear from fellow leaders, I'm bringing my team in 5 days a week. Well, and I ask them why, and we have that discussion. But then I always ask, how often do you plan to be in the office? A couple of days a week. Again, are you living the expectations that you have of your team? Are you being very clear around the why? And again, if you're going to have a culture of accountability, if you're going to have a culture at all, you better behave in alignment with that culture, and you better live and stand for the very things you're expecting others to stand for.
Greg, we've gone over that hour mark, so I know you'll have a meeting lined up. So thank you so much for all your time on this. Really appreciate all your insight and knowledge you shared with us today.
You bet. I'm hoping I added value to your listeners, and listen, I enjoyed the conversation a lot. Thanks for the invite.